Good afternoon. I'm going to address causation. So we're going away from these theoretical and philosophical and legal approaches and more down to the nuts and bolts of what evidence would you bring in a case and how do you prove a case regarding pharmaceuticals. And let me start with this gold standard of proof. You'll often hear, particularly among the defense bar, and I'll preface by saying I'm a member of the plaintiff bar, that you need to have the gold standard of proof, which is a statistically significant, double-blind, prospective, placebo-controlled study before you can ever be satisfied that a drug has caused a particular adverse event. And as we go through today, I think the evidence that we'll look at here is going to show that there has virtually never been such a situation in the history of pharmaceutical regulation in the United States. So it's, again, as Elizabeth was referring, maybe an overplaying of the hand. And in fact, causation usually boils down, in many cases, to just plain old common sense. What types of evidence do we usually see? And if you look at the Daubert opinion with the Bendectin litigation, there are references to the various types of evidence. There's adverse events, published case reports, as you see them here. I generally draw a distinction between adverse events, and published case reports. Adverse event reports are required to be made let me strike that. Adverse event reports are voluntarily made by doctors or consumers to either the corporation, the manufacturer itself, or to the FDA. The manufacturer is required to report any reports that they receive on to the FDA. However, doctors are not required to make adverse event reports, so the reporting rate is usually estimated to be 1 to 3%. It's very low, and they can also be made by consumers. But the point of adverse event reporting, it's also referred to as post-marketing surveillance, is for the drug companies to keep an eye on what's going on in the field with their product. The FDA also keeps an eye on it, and they should be sharing information. That's as opposed to the published case report. Published case reports are written by physicians, and they're usually in a medical journal in the context of a letter to the editor. The difference being that they're fleshed out a little bit more. The doctors may have more in terms of history, particularly more than a consumer would give if they write to the FDA about an adverse event. There have been many instances where the published case report is the means by which a problem with a drug is not only identified, but determined. Earlier today, what Professor Stern was showing us, the thalidomide child. And obviously, thalidomide came to light through adverse events. And we don't turn around and do clinical trials of something like that. You look at the evidence, you see 1, 2, 3 reports of a woman taking thalidomide and a child with these horrible birth defects, and we all have enough common sense to know causation has been established. And if you look at the FDA's criteria, when they look at adverse events, this is how the FDA evaluates. They look at the timing of the exposure and the occurrence of the adverse event, the effect of stopping the exposure, the etiologic roles of the agents and diseases in regard to the adverse events, the response to re-challenge, laboratory tests, and known toxicity of the agent. And if I could just, if I could elaborate on that a little bit, the timing of exposure and the adverse event. For many products, you will see that as soon as the product is given, there's an immediate response. That's a very strong clue that the drug is what's causing the adverse event. Similarly, if you take the drug away and the person gets better, that is important. If you give it to them again and they have the same response again, that's the re-challenge. Those are all very important factors to say, based on the timing and the adverse event that occurred, we believe there's causation. The etiologic roles of the agents, this would pertain to, I can give an example. There's some medications for autoimmune disorders, particularly rheumatoid arthritis or MS, and these will suppress the immune system. Well, what they found is some of the people exposed to these drugs develop tuberculosis, they develop very severe brain bacterial or diseases that are being caused by the fact that the immune system is suppressed. So we can tie these things in, they make logical sense. We don't need to do a clinical trial to show the relationship there. Laboratory test results, previously known toxicity. I think on previously known toxicity, that would also fit back, if you look in the beginning, with the chemical structural analysis. If you know, for instance, that a drug belongs to a certain class, such as, well, we had in the federal litigation that the drugs were sympathomimetic amines, which meant that they constrict the blood vessels. It's not a big leap to say that a drug that constricts the blood vessels is associated with increased blood pressure, heart attacks, and strokes. So again, you don't necessarily have to have these statistically significant studies to have reliable evidence of causation. Sir Bradford Hill is an epidemiologist who is somewhat the father of modern epidemiology, and he wrote an article that's really still considered to be one of the central bases for determining causation. And again, all of these factors, they're very similar to the ones the FDA uses with adverse events. A lot of it, again, is common sense. And it's not that any one factor is more important than the other, or that all of the factors are required. However, the one factor that's always required is you have to take the drug first before the event in order to have causation. Another biological gradient has to do with the dose response. If the problem is more prevalent when a higher dose is given, that's also considered to be a very important proof of causation. Now, case control studies are the first of a type of epidemiology study that I wanted to discuss. There's basically two types of epidemiology studies: case control studies and cohort studies. Epidemiology, think of it as the study of epidemics, is the science of looking at populations of people and determining if there is a causative agent at work for disease. And what we have here in the case control study, this is usually the most effective way to do a scientific study on adverse effect of drugs. The reason being it's quicker, it's cheaper. What you do is you start with the adverse event itself. So let's say, for instance, you're trying to determine if a drug exposure during pregnancy causes cleft lip and cleft palate. So you start with the children who have the defect. You find 50 children, and then you match controls to those children. You find mothers of the same age who lived in the same neighborhood, who had children at the same time, and you randomly pick those according to your criteria, and then you compare statistically what's the difference in the exposures excuse me, between the mothers who had the children with the cleft palates and those who did not. That's called a case control study. The second type of study, a cohort study, you study two groups. And in that, let's say, for instance, you think that a particular drug was causing the problem. Well, you could study 30 women who took the drug and 30 women who didn't, and try to see if there's a difference between the rate of cleft lip and cleft palate, and obviously you're probably not going to get any in either group. So in order to do a cohort study, you have to have a huge number of people in order to get information on a typical, sufficient to make a typical observation. And actually, well, let's see here. Skipping ahead. This is a table that I had prepared in consultation with an epidemiologist. In order to have a cohort study large enough to determine, oh, I've only got 5 minutes, to determine that there is a doubling of the risk if the event occurs 1 out of 1,000, you'd have to have 46,000 people in the study. Now, what's a clinical trial? A clinical trial is when you have the sugar pill, when you intentionally put half the people in a group and expose them to the drug and another half who are unexposed. Those are required in a new drug application, but they're usually required for the focus of efficacy. Is this drug effective? Does it work better? You keep track of the adverse events in a clinical trial, but they aren't really set up to see if there's a difference between, a statistically significant difference in the two groups. So what actually works? Well, the FDA recognizes that adverse events are usually the basis, and observational studies being the case control in the cohort, as opposed to the clinical trial for determining safety. And clinical trials, the weakness is they're done prospectively, they're too short, they don't have enough people in them to determine adverse effects of drugs. So what I've put together here is a chart of all of the drugs that have been taken off the market from 1997 to 2007. There are 23 drugs, and if you can't see this, it is in the materials as well. But for instance, starting with Pondemon and Redux, those are the two fen-phen drugs. Those started off with identification through, I would call it a published case report. It was the Mayo Clinic identified 24 cases of heart valve defects among women, primarily women, using these products. The FDA then went and surveyed some diet clinics and had them go do echocardiograms on a series of patients there who had used fen-phen, and found that a very high percentage had silent proof that they had this valve problem, even though they had no symptoms. So that's why I called that case report and diagnostic. Seldane, an antihistamine, adverse events were the sole basis for taking it off the market. Posicar was an epidemiology study, a 3-year study on congestive heart failure. I skipped Duract. I wanted to talk about that one. That product was approved. It's a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory for use for 10 days or less, because they saw that there was increased liver enzymes in the clinical trials pre-approval. But what happened was, even with the black box warning, it didn't prohibit people from using the product for more than 10 days, so they eventually took it off the market. As you can see, all of these drugs came off with adverse events. Judge Kaplan in the Southern District of New York in the Resolin litigation has written opinions on summary judgment where he expressly recognized that adverse events alone were sufficient to prove causation. If you look at Propulsid, that drug was relabeled 3 times before it was taken off the market, and there were 341 reports of heart rhythm abnormalities and 80 deaths. Lotrinox was only on the market from February 2000 to November 29th of 2000. There were 70 cases of adverse events and 3 deaths. And again, that was simply from adverse event reporting. My time is almost up, but I wanted to skip here. Tegason, which is a psoriasis drug, was associated or was causing birth defects. And what they determined there was another similar psoriasis medication that had a shorter half-life. And that's why I have animal studies and pharmacology on there, because they knew it was causing birth defects, but they knew there was an alternative drug that, through the pharmacology testing in the animal, to show it had a shorter half-life, the animal studies confirmed the birth defects. So between the 3 sources of information, the decision was made to withdraw the drug. And then quickly on Vioxx, the estimate is that there were 27,000 heart attacks and sudden cardiac death caused by use of Vioxx. That was a controlled clinical trial. It was not a placebo control. The other drug being used was Aleve. And I did find the very last one. Trazolol was, I believe that's the one, was a clinical trial with a placebo-controlled product. Also, since I just wanted to talk about warnings very quickly. In 2003, 20 drugs had black box warnings put on them. That's the actual black frame around the warning where something's put in bold type that it's terribly significant that they want the doctors to see. In 2007, 75 products had black box warnings. So we are in a situation where the doctors are faced with a dramatically higher number of drugs on the market that have serious complications. And my time is up. Thank you.